All right, everybody. Are you? Have you gotten what you need? Have you met people, had food, had a beverage? I hope you've connected with some folks. This table looks like there's just too much happening over there. I get nervous. Welcome to Theology on Tap. Glad that you are here. Again, my name is Aaron, and on behalf of St. Alban's Episcopal Church and the wonderful folks at Eastside Revival, welcome, and let's give those guys a round of applause. I want to, before we invite our speaker up tonight, I want to let some of you know that Beth Barr is a big deal. If you are not a person who is on Twitter or you may not realize, but she is leading a national conversation and in Christian communities about the radical idea, bear with me, that women are people. I know. So if you, nothing changes hearts and minds like bumper stickers, so we do have them. If you'd like to pick one up on the way out, patriarchy may be a part of Christian history, but that doesn't make it Christian. If you would like to, if you want to get her book, pick up one of these postcards. It will remind you by showing you what the book looks like, so you can find it and order it online. Also, there are two other things I want to mention in terms of cards. If you are interested, if you have a church home, great. If you are looking for one and you want to know more about St. Albans, there's a little yellow card that you can fill out and put it in the little box on the way out, or hand it to me or the other guy with one of these, or to Rachel, and we will be in touch with you. Secondly, there is on your table an index card. It is blank. There's also a pen on your table. If at some point during the talk you have a question, but you're not the kind of person that likes to raise your hand and ask a question out loud in a room full of people you don't know, we'll collect these at the end and we'll for the Q&A. So that's about it. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Rachel Toombs up to come and introduce our speaker.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am soft-spoken, so I'm going to make out with this mic. If you do not know me, my name is Rachel. I oversee adult formation at St. Albans. I am also the newcomer liaison, which means if you have questions about St. Albans, the Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition, the Trinity, whatever, come find me and we can chat. I also have cards up at the front. But it is my pleasure tonight to introduce Beth Allison Barr. I do need to say that when I was a lowly grad student, not even in her department, she took time to entertain this paper that I thought was great and help me make it greater. So that just shows you, and this was before her big book. So she is a good woman. All right, so let me introduce Beth Allison Barr. She is, let me see if I get this right, the James Vardaman Endowed Professor of History at Baylor University. She does work on European women, medieval and early modern England, hello Anglicans, and church history. So please, St. Albans and guests, welcome Beth Allison Barr.
Okay, y'all can all hear me, right? I'll try to keep it where I don't turn my head too much. Thank you for having me. It's really nice. I didn't know what to expect, so thanks for coming out. I hope I meet your expectations. I'm also really glad to see lots of my grad students around out here, so that's always fun too. They came here tonight even though they had me in seminar yesterday, so I guess that's a good sign. So when Rachel asked me to do this, and asked me to what I wanted to talk about. Honestly, I told her at the time, there was so much going on, I said, I'm out of catchy titles. So why don't we just talk about the unmaking of biblical womanhood? And the reason I said that is because this is the second most frequently asked question that I get. The first most frequently asked question that I get is, what Bible translation do I use now? So we can talk about that if you want to. The second most frequently asked question that I get is, now that I know, what do I do? And while I don't have any magic answers to this, I thought maybe we could think through this for a few minutes, and then I'll be happy to entertain whatever questions that you have. One of the reasons I like to think about this question is because it's the question I have too. When I wrote The Making of Biblical Womanhood, I've told a lot of people this, that it was somewhat an act of desperation. I was at the point in my life where I said something has to be done, and I know all of this stuff that I've been teaching my students for years, and it isn't sinking into the church. And so when Caitlin Beatty approached me and asked me if I'd consider writing this book, I was like, well, might as well give it a shot. So that's what I decided to do. And when we first talked about the book, Caitlin suggested that my final chapter sort of be something about what to do now. And when I got to that final chapter, I didn't want to do that, because I was like, I don't want to give sort of a self-help steps. In fact, I don't really know exactly what steps to take yet, but what I know is that we have to act. And so my final chapter is a call to action. It's not real clear about exactly what are we supposed to do, but we have to do something. We have to act. And it's probably that call to action in my final chapter that got me in so much trouble on Twitter, I think. So I want to think about, what do we do now? And I just have 2 or 3 things. We'll see how much time I have. 2 or 3 things to think about. I think the first thing that we need to do is we need to recognize how serious a problem this is. I think for a long time, when we have thought about women's roles in the church, we've often sort of been like, well, they believe this, and I understand why they believe that, and I believe this, and it's sort of tomato, tomato. And I don't think it is. Because, you see, when we teach a theology that some people, simply because of their bodies, belong by the ordination of God under the power of other people, that's called oppression. And that is not of God. And so I think that we need to take this theology seriously. Now, on the one hand, we do need to extend grace. I totally understand why people believe this. In fact, one of the reasons people believe this is because of the proliferation of conservative Bible translations like the English Standard Version. And I don't know how many of you have ever picked up an English Standard Version. But if that's the only Bible that you have been reading, then it is no surprise to me that you're going to walk away thinking that women cannot have leadership over men. For example, just a couple of things. First of all, Phoebe in Romans 16 is called a servant. She is not called a deacon. There is a footnote below that says deaconess, but y'all, the word used to describe Phoebe is no different from the word used to describe what men are doing. The reason we have turned her into a servant is because we have decided that women cannot have that role. It's not because of what we find in the Bible, it's because of the decisions that we have made. Another example, and I brought here Samuel Perry, who has written this really fantastic article on the ESV, has done this great thing. I like charts. I'm a social historian. I always tell my students I like to count things. So I love it when I have charts. And Samuel Perry has gone through, my grad students are laughing, but Samuel Perry has gone through the ESV and taken all of those sort of troublesome passages about women and has compared them to the RSV. And it is really incredible, the changes that were made in the ESV. And the only reason those changes were made was because the translators of the ESV were complementarian and were wanting to make sure they were wanting to uphold complementarian teachings. And that's it. I've written some things about this. I wrote an article called Deconstructing the ESV if you want to go see all my evidence for the motivations behind the ESV. But one of the passages that we don't talk about as much, which I also think is just as significant, is 1 Timothy 5. And in 1 Timothy 5 in the RSV, it translates verse 14 as, quote, "So I would have younger widows marry, bear children, rule their households." Do you know how the ESV alters that? It alters rule their households to manage their households. Why? Well, because women are supposed to manage the households that men rule. That very subtle change eliminates that authority of women. And this matters. This theology matters. I went last April. I was able to go to England for the first time since COVID. And I am a medieval historian, so I really spend most of my research time reading Middle English sermons. And so I was over with my students. I took a few of my students over. I got a grant to help get all of them into the archives, and we were over there. And when I go to England, my strategy is to take a flight that will take me across the night, where I try to sleep as much as I can, and then I get up in the morning. When I get in London, I go to my hotel, dump my stuff, and go out and just walk the city. That's what I spend the first day doing, trying to beat jet lag. And so this time I did that, and I decided that I wanted to walk some of my favorite streets in London, including going to one of my favorite churches. And the church is in the dead center of the financial district in London, and it's St. Helens Bishopsgate. And it is right. I don't know how many of you know much about the London cityscape, but if you look at the London cityscape and you see a big building that looks like a pickle, a giant pickle, it's the Gherkin. You've seen that, okay? It's on. Its address is 30 St. Mary Axe, right dead center of the financial center, and immediately in front of that church is the 13th century St. Helens Bishopsgate, which is one of the few surviving medieval parish churches, and it is also the only, in the greater city of London, the only remnants from a medieval nunnery. And that church actually once housed a very lively collection of medieval nuns who were connected to Shakespeare, the parish was connected to Shakespeare as well as to Chaucer. And if you're very familiar with Chaucer, he tells a story about an abbess who has all of these pet dogs. And this is probably the abbess of St. Helens Bishopsgate, because she did. And if you read in the records, the nuns are always getting in trouble for wearing very expensive hats and blowing kisses to the congregants over the screen, dividing the nave and the church. And so if you go into the church, the evidence of these nuns is just everywhere, where you can see if you know what you're looking for. And so this time when I went, I wanted to get up into the balcony area. Last time I was there, I wasn't able to do this because they had it closed off. And I wanted to get a picture of the nave because it very clearly shows the double nave where the nuns were on one side and there was the screen separating, and then the parishioners sat on the other side. And so I wanted to use it so I could show my students what this looked like. And when I got up there and reached down, looked over to take a picture, my heart just sank. Because this church has been reconstituted by a group of evangelical Anglicans who are more conservative. In fact, I learned later that this church had split from the Church of England over the issue of women's ordination. And when I stood in that balcony and looked down, and they had all the chairs out in this medieval church that's filled with the echoes of women religious living their call for God, every chair was filled with an ESV. And my heart just sank, because this theology is not only strong in the heart of Waco, but it has been exported. And I could tell you so many stories about the impact that it's having, moving out into places like China and Africa and India. In 2014, Crossway Publishers raised enough money to send 250,000 ESV Bibles. Their goal was to get them into the hands of strategic church leaders in India, Africa, and Asia. And China. And they had such a successful campaign that they immediately launched another one to raise another $400,000 to send even more Bibles out. And so this theology is being exported. And I would argue that it is a dangerous theology. One of the most memorable quotes that people always share with me back about the making of biblical womanhood is one at the beginning of chapter 7, towards the end. And I remember exactly when I was writing it. It was spring of 2021. My book manuscript was due April 10th, 2021. I don't want to tell you how close this was to that deadline. But nonetheless, I remember I had just been, I'm friends with Jamar Tisby, and I had been following some of his writings, and he had just posted this really gut-wrenching story about racism, alive and well in white Christian spaces. And I remember I just sat down and I wrote the words based upon a movie that my husband has made me watch a lot of times, The Usual Suspects. And I sat down, and as I said, I remember exactly where I was. I was sitting right outside my porch, and I said, the greatest trick the devil has ever pulled is convincing Christians that oppression is godly, that some people, just because of their bodies or skin color, are ordained to be under the power of others. And I firmly believe that. So I think if we want to unmake biblical womanhood, we need to recognize how serious this is and how pervasive it is. So then, of course, the next question is, again, what do we do if we know that it's serious and we know that it's pervasive? I think the second thing that we have to do is we need to expand the boundaries of our lives. And I mean that in several different ways. One of the things that I think we have to really do in our mostly white churches is we have to realize that Christianity is not a white religion. It has never been a white religion. In some ways, we are the interlopers into a faith that was born in a brown world. And we have imported European imperialism into and made it a part of the heart of Christianity. And one of the reasons I get, so let me watch my time here. One of the reasons I get so frustrated with people, people all the time will send me messages and say things like, well, what do you think about 1 Timothy 2? How do you handle 1 Timothy 2? And my response is, that's the wrong question. I'm like, do you know how white that question is? Because first of all, these are not conversations that we find in the global world. Because I think people who are not caught up in these texts of terror that Phyllis Tribble has named them, these texts that keep women out of leadership and keep women under the power of men, these people in other parts of the world are able to see more clearly what all the women are doing in other parts of the Bible. I mean, this is just crazy to me. How did we allow a handful of verses to hijack everything else the Bible does with women? And so I think if we read people, if we expand the boundaries of what we know and start reading people who don't look like us, we find a very different perspective. And not only do we need to expand that, but we need to expand that to our friends and to our family members. One of my graduate students here, I won't point her out, but we've been working on a project for my next book. And we have this lovely spreadsheet. And it shows we've been collecting all of the books that have been written on pastors' wives. And that's been very, very interesting. And one of the things that we have very clearly found is that the theology that is creating this idea about pastors' wives, I don't want to give too much away from my next book, is a very closed group. We have identified some of the major sources that produce this literature, and it is things like the Gospel Coalition, Desiring God, the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, and the SBC. And they are producing this literature, they are endorsing it for each other, and then they are mass marketing it, and that is all white churches are reading. And it's amazing to me how small that circle is. I mean, we can count the people who are at the heart of creating this literature that is buttressing this theology that has hijacked Jesus. And I think we need to open our eyes to that, and we need to open our eyes to our complicity in continuing the mass marketing of this theology, and allowing it to persist within our churches. So I'll stop so that we can have questions. So I'll sum up. We want to unmake biblical womanhood. Two things that we have to do to start with is we have to recognize how serious the problem is. As somebody living in Waco, Texas, I don't think I need to tell anyone how most churches in Waco, Texas do not support women in ministry. And so even just in this area, we can see how much this theology has a stranglehold on white evangelical Christianity. So we need to recognize the seriousness of this problem. And we also need to start reading and pushing literature and helping our friends and our family read things from people who don't look like us and understand that the God of the Bible is bigger than white Southern evangelical culture. And that's one of the things that I really am obviously very passionate about. So I think maybe I'll stop there and turn it over for questions. That sounds okay. Yeah.
Yes, we can. So let us begin, because some in this room are privileged enough to have grown up in churches where this is not an issue. So can you define for us what you mean when you say a church is complementarian?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. Defining terms. So complementarian is a theology that is very, very new. It originated literally in a restaurant of a hotel in 1986, 1987, near Wheaton, at an at the ETS, the Evangelical Theology Society meeting, where a group of these theologians that are also, and pastors that are at the heart of organizations like the Gospel Coalition and the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood and the SBC, they got together and they decided that the church that despite the conservative resurgence of the Southern Baptist Convention in 1979, that the church was still drifting into liberalism. And part of this was because the emphasis on what it means to be a godly man and a godly woman was being lost. And so they wanted to create a new energy to bring back this teaching in churches that women are ordained by God to follow their husbands. I mean, that's really, if men lead, women follow. That's complementarian theology, they root in Scripture. And so they decided that the word patriarchy didn't sound good. And so they decided to use a different word, and the word they chose was complementarian. And that's literally where it came from. And this was also the beginning of the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. They also approved what is called the Danvers Statement, which articulates this hierarchical gender theology, and began to really push it out. So this is like less than 10 years after the conservative resurgence, in which the Southern Baptist world was taken over by Paige Patterson and Paul Pressler, and the takeover of the seminaries began to reinforce fundamentalist theology as well as a hierarchical gender theology within our seminaries. And their idea was, if they take over the seminaries that educate the pastors, then that will transform the church. And they were right, because that's exactly what's happened.
It's really fascinating how new it actually is, because in my undergrad, we won't say exactly when, but we'll say early 2000s, it was taken as a given that you were complementarian or you were egalitarian, as though that was an obvious choice forever. But in fact, it was created. I'm going to pause for a moment. If you do have a question on your card, I am going to put to work my small group leaders. If you have a question, can you raise it up in the air? And if you are a small group leader and there's one near you, can you grab it and bring it to me? You didn't know you were signing up for this, did you? Thank you. You can write quickly if you have one. We're good? So we're going to start with these, and then we'll do open forum. And by these right now, it is one. All right. They're being written. Well, as you have them, if you're brave, you can walk them up to me, or you can hand them to someone brave. But here's our first one. I'm not reading the beginning of it. I can almost guess who wrote this by the comment. If it's not too personal, tell us about your parents. Did they help inform your knowledge and belief, or play a role in it?
Oh, sure. My parents go to First Baptist Waco. And my mother helped start the Fair Trade shop at Mission Waco. It's very, very active. You will find her on Wednesdays volunteering at the Mission Waco, and on Fridays volunteering at the Gospel Cafe, and doing all sorts of other work during the week as well. So yes, my parents were instrumental, I think, in helping me get out. And I tell people, when my parents both grew up in different types of Baptist churches. My father actually grew up in a family that was much more Methodist than Baptist, very small Texas town. But his mother was definitely the one who wore the pants. And she was a formidable woman, a wonderful woman. And my mother grew up originally in the North American Baptist, which North American Baptists are different from Southern Baptists. And in 1980, when we moved to Texas, we moved to a small Texas town. It's right after the conservative resurgence. And our Baptist church that we went to slowly over time became more and more conservative. I tell the story that I can see it unfolding in my life, the emphasis on complementarianism, where I can see women less and less visible in the church. I remember this. And I remember, and by the time I got to my high school years, I remember when we had our first True Love Waits weekend. It was brand new. All of this was brand new. It was the very end of my high school career. And it's really by the time I got into college in the late 90s when when complementarian theology has become the only godly way to read the Bible, and it has taken over evangelical spaces. In 1992 was when John Piper and Wayne Grudem's Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood came out, which is sort of the complementarian Bible. And then it is the early 2000s is when we see the ESV come out. And then you can think about moving forward with the foundation of groups like Acts 29, the Mark's 9 network, Acts 29, of course, also with Mark Driscoll. So anyway, so we see those all form out. So yes, so my parents were at that conservative church, but at the same time, it was they also knew something different. And I think that was very helpful, whereas even though I did get pulled into that world, at the same time, I always had models that I knew there was another way. And I think that helped me as I became more and more uncomfortable with reconciling complementarian teachings with what I knew as a historian.
Yeah, that reminds me, I'm going to call out our female priest, who is just a priest. To be clear, it's not like you're special, you're a priest. But I want to say that visibility matters, that some of Kara's ministry is simply doing the work of a priest and looking in a way that many feel the need, I need to reconcile this because she is clearly a priest, but not the kind of priest or pastor I've ever seen. So that kind of knowing there's a way out of a way of thinking is important work. All right, questions, I'm going to repeat them because we are live, but tell them to me. Do we have a sheet? Or you can say it out loud. You're brave, you can handle it. What is your question? Maybe you're not.
Thanks,
Yeah, no problem. All right, so the question, is this the idea of biblical womanhood, actually a secondary issue? And if so, and you find yourself in a tradition of complementarian holdings, what is your advice?
Oh, yeah. So first of all, it's really interesting to me how we turn everything into hierarchies. First order, second order, third order, these are all sort of new. It's interesting to me how we do that. If you mean, and I know what secondary means, but if we mean, is this the gospel? No, of course it's not the gospel. In fact, that's my argument in the Making of Biblical Womanhood, is that complementarianism has been written into the gospel. And so that is, and that in order to be a faithful Christian, you have to believe in this gender hierarchy. And that is very wrong. So no, it is not part of the gospel. Our salvation is based upon belief in Jesus. And that is not connected to some of our other ideas about the Bible. So I would say it is not. And in fact, I think our world has lost the ability to talk with people who believe differently from us. And I think it's really important that we learn how to work with churches that believe differently from us on theological issues. One of the things, if you follow the history of complementarian churches, and if you even look at them, one of the things they often do is they withdraw from communities. They withdraw from communities of churches and become much more isolated within themselves. And I won't call out any names. But it's interesting that they often are the ones who pull back out. And I think part of that is because they've written this into the gospel where they say faithful Christians believe this. So if they're involved with other churches where you see faithful people who clearly love Jesus as much as they do and are doing the work of God, how do they reconcile that with this theology? And I think that's it's sort of part of that slippery slope. So I don't think that this is a salvation issue. I also, even though I think it's an very important issue, I think part of the problem is people don't realize how dangerous this theology is. We just don't think it through. Most people are good people. Most husbands treat their wives well. Most marriages, I would argue that most marriages that actually function well function as egalitarian marriages, because how can you really, you function as partners. And so I would argue that that often is. And so many people just don't hit a ceiling. It doesn't ever, it's Russell Moore wrote about this in 2006 where he was angry about it, or he was cranky about it, not angry. But he said, we just give complementarianism lip service, that we say we do it, but we don't. Most of our families function as complete partnerships without a head. We let women do all of these things in our churches. We're not really. And so it was interesting to me how that left unto our own devices, we do resort more to partnerships and letting people use their gifts. It's artificial coming in and drawing lines. I don't know if you've ever looked up, Wayne Grudem has a list, I think it's like 86, 87 things on what women can and cannot do in the church. I don't know if you go read that. It's really fascinating. So that's half of your question, David. The other half is, what do I do if I'm in a complementarian church? I get this question all the time. I get this question from people who cannot change their situation. I've gotten this question from clergy who will lose their job, seminary professors who will lose their job, as well as people who love their church. And my advice is they need to be where they are called. And I tell people over and over that if we hadn't been kicked out, I don't know if we would have left, simply because we knew we were making a difference in that space. We knew that we were helping our teenagers see. That's probably why we got fired. But we were helping them live into their callings, regardless of whether they were young men or young women. And that was an effective ministry. And as I said, I think, and so we probably would have stayed, and I probably would have never written The Making of Biblical Womanhood, because I would have felt like we were doing effective ministry within that space. So I think that is a choice. I think if you are in a space where you are called and you can make a difference and you feel like people are listening to you, if you're in a church where even if they may argue for complementarianism, if they're willing to listen, if they're willing to still let you teach, just even though you disagree with them, that's actually a really good sign. It's the places that refuse to allow you to speak, who remove you from teaching positions once they find out that you might have some difference of opinion on this issue. Those are the places that I would say you might think about it, because they have drawn really hard lines, and that may not be a place in which you can flourish. So I think it depends, yeah.
Similar, it is telling that this is where people go when they hear you speak, is the now what. Yeah. But I was telling Beth about my undergrad professor who felt called to be a pastor, and she was told to marry one, and in her middle age decided to pursue the things she felt called to in the beginning. And so sometimes we can stay and work in spaces, and sometimes we can't. When do you leave places that are active in practicing patriarchy, biblical womanhood, and then other extensions of oppression, like, for example, racism?
Oh, yeah. Yes, patriarchy and racism go hand in hand. Once you buy into one form of oppression, it's a lot easier to buy into another form. So when should I leave? Again, I get questions like this all the time. I think it has to do with the response of the place you are in. Like, for example, I totally understand why people believe that women belong under the authority of men theologically, and why they believe women cannot be in ministry. It is because they have been raised on this teaching, they have never seen anything different, and they use Bibles like the ESV. I totally understand it. What I don't understand is people not being willing to consider they might be wrong on this issue. And it seems to me that churches that refuse to allow conversation about this, churches that refuse to allow women in spaces where even in their theology, women should be in those spaces, those very hard gender lines. I would also be very suspicious of churches that are much more inward-looking than outward-looking. And oftentimes the inward-looking churches are also not very interested in social issues and are not very interested in listening to conversations and listening to different theological understandings. And so those are spaces that if you are in those spaces, I mean, as I said, one of the things you can do is kind of like what my husband and I did. We were like, well, we might as well try. And so you can try, and it may turn out well for you. Who knows? Maybe you can make a really big difference. But it will also tell you maybe whether or not you want to stay there. So I think, I can't give straight answers on this, but that would sort of be my gut. I mean, I think if we're going to change how people, at least help people understand that there's another way to see this issue, we're going to have to work both inside and outside of these spaces. We need people on both the inside and the outside. This is also the reason why Al Mohler is not happy with me. Or was it Denny Burr? I can't remember. I forget which one called. But anyway, they said it was my secret plan to get women in ministry. And I was like, yes, it is my secret plan, But anyway, so yeah, if that helps.
So sneaky. No, we're good. Okay. So a good number of us in this room are Episcopalian, and we like to think ourselves as moving beyond these conversations and free from all the oppressive limits and super enlightened. What other work do folks like us still have to do, even in a tradition that rather publicly is egalitarian?
So let me give you another really good book. It's written by a woman named Lisa Weaver Schwartz, who is a sociologist at Asbury University. And she has written a really brilliant book called Stained Glass Ceilings, in which she compares women at Southern Seminary, which is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention, flagship of complementarianism within the SBC, and Asbury Seminary, which is a Methodist seminary and has been supporting women in ministry for a very long time. And what she found is just absolutely fascinating. She found that the spaces of Southern Seminary actually empowered women more to teach the Bible and to be equipped than Asbury Seminary did with its gender blindness. And, it's sort of like people are like, yes, of course we support women in ministry, but they don't understand that because women have been shut out of these spaces for so long, as well as the fact that patriarchy permeates our society, and it is harder for women have fewer networks than men, to get jobs in pastoral ministry. They have a harder time often going to seminaries, getting funding for seminaries, and getting internships, getting all of the pieces that they need that would help them move into pastoral positions. Every piece of that is harder for a woman than it is for a man. And so if spaces, traditions that support women in ministry, if they do not actively recognize how their spaces are still built on a male model and still privilege men, we're not going to move women into really those churches are not going to become egalitarian spaces. We're going to have token women. A few women. We're like, oh, we're good. We've got the woman right there. We also do this with people of color. We're like, we're good. We've got the person right there. But that's called tokenism. That's not actually having moved the needle. And so I think I would say, and you can look at this is very clear statistically, even in egalitarian spaces, women in mainline denominations are much fewer and far between, especially in primary leadership roles. How many women out there are actually, although I hate the word like senior or lead pastor, but anyways, used so much, but how many women are in those positions? They're very few and far between. And that's because we have changed our tune without changing the structure. And so we are still operating on that same structure that is built around training up men and moving men through these networks, and women are still shut out of that. And so Lisa Weaver Schwartz's book is really brilliant in showing that up close and personal by comparing those two seminaries. It also helps explain, I get this question all the time. People are like, why do women stay in these places? And I'm like, if you stay in the lines, you're often treated really well. You get book contracts, you get, you can flourish as Bible study leaders, you get all sorts of support. And they have very strong networks that support women as long as they stay within the lines. And some women are like, you know what, this works, I'm effective here. It works. So.
It's helpful. It reminds me of sometimes in terms of racial justice, we talk about we don't enslave people anymore, right. Emancipation, we should all be fine. And it's a good reminder that even in spaces like ours, there's work to do, but it's also a good pastoral word for women who feel like, why is this so much harder for me? Am I weak? Am I imagining it? It's an encouragement that even in more welcoming spaces, there's still work to do. Not personal at all for me. So I do have a question, because complementarianism is newer with our friends Piper and Grudem. I come from the land of Piper, so I know that land well. But patriarchy is not new, and you study medieval women. So what has changed, and what is a much larger issue that the church has been wrestling with for a very long time?
Well, this was a central component of the Making a Biblical Womanhood, and my graduate students also know this well. We say this all the time. It's a quote from a scholar named Judith Bennett, and patriarchy is everywhere, but patriarchy is not everywhere the same. And I think that's one of the things that we have to realize. I say all the time, people are like, well, the Bible, there's patriarchy in the Bible, and I'm like, yes, because it's humans. It's telling the story of humans and of people, and we build hierarchies of oppression. We build these things, and it always is striking to me. I'm like, why are we trying to live in the world created by humans, patriarchy, instead of the vision that God has called us to? The biblical world is patriarchal, but the God of the Bible is not. And so I think, we have to learn, we have to separate those things. What was the question? I completely blanked.
What is new and what is...
Oh, what is new? Yeah, that's why I was talking about this. So patriarchy is not new. This is something else, too, that people all the time, they're like, well, women have never been... this is not a new thing. Women weren't priests in the medieval world, so why do you expect them to be pastors today? And that statement shows me what they do not know. Because the reason that women were mostly not priests in the medieval world was because their bodies were considered to be literally less well, their bodies were broken. Their bodies were not the male body was epitomized the perfect creation. The female body was flawed and more sinful and more prone to sin. It was more porous. We can get into all of these things. So women were seen as not being able, literally their bodies made them too weak. But that also allowed a loophole in the medieval world that if you could overcome your bodies, if you could overcome your sex, you could have the authority of men. One of the medieval sermons that I use, it says, "Women in God be men." And sort of this idea that women can overcome the weaknesses of their bodies through the power of God and lead and serve like men, which is why Hildegard of Bingen went on preaching tours. Yeah, that's the paper that Rachel wrote many years ago. But that's why Hildegard of Bingen went on preaching tours and preached to the most significant leaders in the church, these male leaders, to mixed crowds of men and women, and some completely male clergy. And that is because the medieval theology had a loophole that if women overcame their bodies, they could become these authorities. After the Protestant Reformation, and this is not all the fault of the Reformation, this is sort of the resurgence of patriarchy here. Reformation theology, I think I wrote this in the book too, Reformation theology should have set women free, but it didn't. Because Reformation theology taught that both women and men are made in the image of God, and there's nothing wrong with female bodies. And so they had to come up with a new reason why women. This is the resurgence of patriarchy, a new reason. And the reason that they came up with is that, even though the complementarianism is new, this very recent form of it, the idea that God ordered women to be under the authority of men is not new. And that was the new reason that was given, is that women were made to be underneath male leadership. And it's not that their bodies, anything's wrong. It's not their bodies that causes it. It's simply because God has created the female being to be under the authority of the male being. And that feeds into. And so even though their priests, there mostly weren't female priests, the reasons for it are radically different. And that is the continuation of patriarchy. And I think one of the reasons that we can tell that patriarchy is of this world is because it changes according to this world. It's a shapeshifter, as one of my friends said. And so we keep trying to live into that pattern of the world instead of what I believe is what God has called us to, which is a bigger and better vision.
Yeah, we always think we're so original when really we're just, reforming old things in new ways. So I need to define a term to ask this question, and that is, this question has to do with intersectionality. And intersectionality is the belief that when we talk especially about oppression, the marginalized, and those with privilege, that you can't just talk about one group, one marginalized group, and be able to speak well about these systems of oppression. So if we're talking about women, what other marginalized people are we also talking about to get a fuller picture of the system and speak more truly about the oppression? So the question, Beth, is how does your work address intersectionality? For example, Black women, queer women, etc. And how can your work be applied to the LGBTQ conversation in the church?
So when I was writing, it was a tension that I had when writing The Making of Biblical Womanhood, because on the one hand, the history shows us that this modern manifestation of it is really born in white evangelical spaces. It's a white woman's problem that has bled over into other parts. But at the same time, it is rooted in general systems of oppression. I mean, that's what it is. It's not, it's a parallel, I guess, form. And I think one of the things that it has, I think there's so much application of these same sort of ideas, I think, in recognizing how we have built the structures of our church, instead of showing the goodness of God on silencing voices of people who aren't like us and shutting people out of spaces. And I don't think Jesus ever shut people out. I think, there's a lot of theological conversations that we could have here, but I think at the very least we need to recognize that a lot of our theologies of oppression are built on fear instead of on the grace of God. And I think regardless of who a person is, what color, race, sexual orientation, that Jesus died for them. And I think we need to ground ourselves more in that. If we want to reach the world, if we want, this is what's so ironic to me about the Southern Baptists being such a prominent push on many of these oppressive teachings, is because originally, the Baptist vision was to bring the gospel to the whole world. And so it's interesting to me how that gospel has gotten very small and only for a certain type of people. And so I think we need to think about what is motivating us. And are we being motivated by the gospel of Jesus? And are we truly bringing the gospel of Jesus? Or are we trying to carry our own personal prejudices or our own theological understandings, which I think it's fine. We all will have different theological understandings, but are we prioritizing those over the gospel? And so I think that may be,
Thanks, Beth. We have time for one more question. Who wants to fight it out? Yes, Chris.
Would you have had a different understanding of women in the church had you grown up in a different part of the country?
So for our online viewers, would you have a different position or vision of women in the church had you not grown up where you did and when you did?
Yes. I think that a lot of complementarian theology is grounded in the Southern white U.S. culture. Now, as I said, this doesn't mean that the patriarchy isn't everywhere, but I think that there are spaces. I talk to women who tell me, who are like, this was not my experience. I was in a church that I was never told that there was a limit on what God called me to. And it is so refreshing to hear those women's stories, because there is a different world of faithful Christians who are faithfully doing the work of God, who support women in ministry and try to help women in wanting to be in ministry. And so, I think, in the Northeast, you will find much more support of women in ministry. You may not have some of these conversations. The West is interesting because we also have this whole sort of Southern culture that's been imported to the central part of California. And that's manifested in interesting ways with John MacArthur's church, Grace to You, et cetera. So I don't know, but I think we have to realize that part of this is a culture. This isn't Christianity. And I think it's really hard for us to separate. I think we've forgotten how to separate our culture from our faith. And I was listening to a lecture at Baylor not too long ago, and he was talking about how white European missionaries, how they imported this culture into the African world. And it's so clearly, when we stand and look at it from a historical perspective, we're like, oh yeah, when you're trying to put bras on women in Africa, that's definitely European culture being imported. But it's interesting to me is now when it's right up in our face, we don't see how we are also trying to import our culture. So yes.
I am going to invite up our Associate Rector in a moment, but first, let us give Beth a final thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. As the grandson of Southern Baptist missionaries myself, this is, really meaningful conversation to have. We want to say farewell. We want to say thank you for coming. We want to say thank you to Revival Eastside. We want to say thank you to Rachel. Someone remarked to me sort of on the way in and as the crowd started to sort of fill up, to have an event sponsored by an Episcopal church, a church that is supposedly dying, that has this much engagement and interest. It's a really, really beautiful and lovely thing. So we are so thrilled that you are here. We ask that if you have any questions about St. Albans, that you would again sort of fill out that a card there and drop it in the box back there by Victor. Thank you, Victor, as well, for being here and helping us man the doors, etc., and all that good stuff. We want to invite you back next week for Dr. Lance Green and Consumerism at the End of the World, which promises to be a very timely and wonderful talk. I'll think about it as I get into my Hyundai Kona tonight. And as I check my Timex watch, I see that it's just passed. So thank you again to everyone who made this evening possible. Thank you to Dr. Barr once again, and we'll see you next week. Goodbye. Thank you to Robert as well. Sorry, Robert. You did a fantastic job. We're very thankful for you as well.